Welcome to Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Joyous conversations about what the afterlife evidence and modern science combine to tell us is true about our one reality. You have nothing to fear. You are eternal and you are perfectly loved. Knowing the truth changes everything. Now, here's Roberta.
Welcome to Seek Reality. I'm Roberta Grimes, and I am so happy you're with us today. Oh, my dear friends, our guest today is a legend in the field of afterlife-related books and publications, and he's also a very old friend of mine. Well, he's not old, but our friendship is old. Jonathan Beecher is with us for the fourth time after what has really been much too long an absence. John was born in Chiswick, in London. He's speaking to us from London now. And he left his formal education 4 months after his 15th birthday. After taking some blue-collar jobs and also a stint at selling clothes, he tells us that he stumbled into the music business, as I guess everybody does in London.
As you do.
Remember the Beatles? Well, he's one of those guys. He co-founded a new publicly quoted entertainment company and an independent record company, and he spent 3 decades in what gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson called the TV industry's long plastic highway. But then a very fall, which included a head injury in the year 2000, changed his life. For what seemed to then to be no apparent reason, but I think it was God calling, John Beecher began to talk about death. He told everyone who would listen to him that there is no death, which of course there is no death. We know that. People thought he had found God, but he says that he hadn't even been looking for God. Well, perhaps God had been looking for John, and he had found him. That led John to found White Crow Books. The name of this one-man publishing house comes from psychologist William James's famous saying that in order to disprove the theory that all crows are black or that there's no life after death, all you have to do is find that one white crow. Or all you really need to find is proof that a few people actually have survived their deaths. And I've done that research too, as my listeners know by now. And yes, there are many, many, many people who can be proven to have survived their deaths. John Beecher says that he never set out to write about Jesus or the afterlife. Jesus actually back then wasn't even really on his radar. But the journey wouldn't leave him alone. So now he's in a very different hallway. He tells us that it's one that's less chaotic and it's far more interesting. And today he's back on Seek Reality finally with a thoroughly fascinating book. I've been reading it called No One's Dead, The Jesus Messages. I love this book. My very, very dear John, it's been far too long. Welcome. It's delightful to have you back with us again.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you after I don't know how many years, but it seems like a long time.
It does seem like a few years.
You haven't changed a bit.
Oh, aren't you sweet to say that? My publisher says it's time I had a new picture taken, and I thought that was a terrible thing for her to say.
Well, I don't know. Maybe you look better. I mean, who knows? You can improve. You're getting younger by the day.
Thank you. That's so wonderful. Thank you for saying that. Well, I want you to know I love this book. And what's great about this book is that this is Jesus talking through some people who had been channeling him, actually doing automatic writing right around the turn of the 20th century. And it's not as if he was saying anything new. He said things that he has said to me when I visited him with one of his best friends. He has friends too. He has a life too that's very modern, because we know among all the people who are not dead, we sure for sure know that Jesus is not dead, and he's holding court in the astral plane, and people visit him there. In fact, anybody who wants to visit him after you've died, all you have to do is say the word and you get to visit Jesus. And he told me, among other things, that you have him saying in his book, he did not die for our sins. As he says in his book, those are all still
Those are on us. Those are on us.
Right. Oh, John, where do you want to start to talk about this great book that you've put together? As you said, you didn't write it. It's the people who have been coming through automatic writing, including Jesus, who have written it. Where would you like to begin?
Well, I think it came about by. Were you aware of Robert Bigelow's competition about 3 or 4
Yes.
years ago? So
Yeah.
Bigelow did his competition for the best evidence for survival of bodily death, and it was a big prize money. Do you remember? It was like $2 million of prize money, and
Uh-huh.
basically he had this sort of Institute of Consciousness, and they sent out emails to see if people wanted to enter. And he sent me an email, White Crow. He said, "Oh, your authors, I see you publish books about this kind of stuff, and if you'd like to forward this to your people, please do that." Anyway, so I did that, and I wrote back and said, I just wrote a quick note back and said to the guy who worked for him, well, I said, I think it's a kind of laudable thing to do, and it will raise the profile. But I don't think you'll find out anything new, any new evidence. You'll just find lots more evidence. In other words, I don't think you'll find more. So that's what kind of prompted me to it. And about that time, and I had this idea that I was going to write a letter to Robert about this kind of thing. And while I was pondering writing this letter, because I wasn't thinking about writing a book, and I wasn't thinking about a book about Jesus, I was just thinking about writing a book. But so to say that the evidence, from my perspective, has kind of been demonstrated for a long, long time. If anybody wants to find it, the evidence is there. So therefore, and more interesting is what happens afterwards, and what are the consequences. And
Yes.
if
I
there are
agree.
any
That's
consequences,
most
is the
interesting.
age-old question. And then what happened was, while I was thinking about writing this letter, this all happened within the space of a few days. An American guy who was retired in Thailand, got in touch with me at White Crow Books, and I think he thought it was a book promotion service. And he years ago had reprinted the messages by this guy James E. Paget, who was a Washington attorney who lived around the early 20th century, who started receiving messages from his wife after she died, and then from his family, and then from these biblical figures and historic figures. And he was getting messages from Jesus, and he didn't believe it's from Jesus. He just threw them away, the initial ones. But his family on the other side, who he'd kind of validated, had evidence that it was then said, no, this is definitely Jesus, and these other biblical communicators. And so for the next 9 years, he spent the rest of his life writing down these messages. So anyway, this guy in Thailand had republished, if you like, a load of the works years ago, and he wanted me to help. But I couldn't really help him because I said I'm a book publisher. I don't promote other books. But I said, why don't we, if you like, this is on an email. Why don't we have a conversation? Why don't we have a Zoom chat? And if I can give you any help, pointers, I will. So we arranged to have a chat. And on this particular day, this is what I'm thinking about writing the letter to Robert, to have a conversation about this guy, James Paget, who I was aware of, but I thought the stuff was a bit religious for me. I read some of them years ago, because there's thousands of these messages. On the same day I'm having a conversation with this guy in Thailand, someone wrote in the comments on the book company website on a blog, James Paget. And I thought, that's interesting. I thought, there's been over 10,000 comments on that website. And when was the last time anybody mentioned James Paget? And the answer is, I checked, because you can go through and look, and hadn't been mentioned for 7 years. I thought, okay. And this is the same day. So I'm thinking, maybe I should pay attention to Paget.
Yeah.
And then of course, so I started looking at them. And then, of course, there's all these afterlife reports, which I've published hundreds of books and probably read thousands of reports. And they all have an idea about, the people who don't believe that Jesus existed, they all say, well, no, he did exist. Or the people, and they have ideas about what he is and the Christ and all this sort of thing. And so then I started thinking, well, if, we get this everybody has an opinion about him. So if we're writing a book about what happens after you die, why not someone who claims to be Jesus? Now, there are a lot of people there's a lot of communicators claim to be Jesus, and clearly they're not all correct. And you've had mediums who say they saw Jesus, and they come up with these different stories. There's some guy in Australia who says he's the reincarnation of Jesus, and his wife's Mary Magdalene. You get all this kind of stuff around. But anyway, Paget was a large body of work. And then there was also, of course, Helen Schucman's A Course in Miracles, which was an enormous text, and she was a sort of Jewish atheist who came out with this 480,000 word text, also claiming to be Jesus. So I really I ended up writing the book. Well, the first half of it is really about the evidence for a greater reality. And I go through the whole thing with spiritualism and life after death and the evidence and premonitions and all this kind of thing.
Right.
And then I get into and then part two gets into the what's wrong with the Bible? Not what's wrong with the Bible. What's wrong with the Christian dominations of where they say it's wrong and why it's causing problems and so on and so forth.
Well, the thing about there are a lot of things that are wrong with Christianity as it's now practiced. And what I love about your book is that Jesus agrees with me. I mean, he has already told me that he agrees with me in person, but there's your book saying he's saying the same thing to the world. I did not die for your sins. I had already figured that out. I mean, he never says it when he was here. Hey, I came to die for your sins. Don't you think if he was going to do that, he would have like mentioned it? Here I go to the cross for your sins. He would have said something about that. No,
Well, I think
he never did.
No, bearing in mind, now, the other thing you have to understand is coming from a sort of atheist background for years and then having these kind of experiences, for multiple experiences. So then come switching to there is no death, then reading. I didn't come from, I'm not a religious person now in that sense. We'll put it this way, there's not really, so I wasn't attached to the idea. So I was happy. In other words, I wasn't attached to an idea. I had this knowing, if you like, that there is no death. And I was happy for him to say whatever they say. And so what was interesting was, so you have obviously reports, thousands of reports from around the world, afterlife reports come through, talk about Jesus and have different ways. And they talk about what he did on his life here. And I'm not really interested in that. I'm more interested in the nature of reality. If we can even grasp that kind of idea and what happens after we die and there is no death, but what happens. And so I was just letting them speak for themselves. So I wasn't, and eventually you come up with some kind of roadmap and they were saying things like, I didn't die for your sins. I'm not God in the way you think God is. We're divine, in the sense that there is still the one God. He's saying, but the bigger problem, because how does it matter? So why does it matter? So, because most people, if you're an atheist, like, you don't care whether Jesus is God or isn't, who cares? It doesn't really matter. But what's interesting is they talk about the billions of people that have never died. So they're all somewhere, they're all housed somewhere. And a lot of them are not doing well. They haven't progressed very far. And the reason they haven't progressed very far is because Christianity, the mainstream Christianity, teaches that hell is some eternal state. And for 2,000 years, even if they haven't believed it, they've had that in the back of their minds. And they're kind of stuck in these kind of lower, if you like, levels, or they are progressing.
It does not help people progress at all.
Because they believe it's permanent. And they're saying, this is not good news. You need to get with the program. That's and realize that, so the most important thing is to know you're going to continue after life. But if you find yourself feeling a bit strange, just understand it's not permanent. You can keep going.
Yes, it's really unfortunate because this Christianity was not founded by Jesus, and it does not even teach what Jesus taught. It's so appalling to me.
Yeah.
The teachings are packaged nicely inside. Fortunately, the Bible does package the gospel teachings. It preserves them. But then the religion that Constantine created teaches something else altogether. It teaches this nonsense about Jesus died for your sins, when Jesus didn't die for that reason at all. What Jesus told me in his words, by the way, he speaks with a very cute accent. English is not his primary language, as you would expect, would not be his primary language. He told me he died because he wanted to prove to people that we do not die. And so he had experimented with resurrecting small animals that had died. When he was still alive, he had experimented with bringing
nothing about that, but okay.
And he thought he could do that with his own body. And so he was going to have a very public death, the most public death you could imagine. I mean, imagine planning calmly to be crucified. What a horrible death to choose. But that was going to be very public. People would know he was stone cold dead. And he was stone cold dead, or that body was. Then he would rise from the dead after 3 days. Well, sure enough, that's what he did. And now they have calculated that all the energy that we can generate on this earth is not enough to produce the scorch that's on the Shroud of Turin. Even all the energy we can produce on this earth all at once is not enough to produce that scorch. So that's
I don't know about the Shroud. I've read about the Shroud of Turin and listened to interviews about it, and I think it's quite. I always thought the most interesting thing was that they said they couldn't replicate it now, although now someone's come out and said they can replicate it. But that's a whole different story. I mean, who knows? I mean, I think from my perspective was what these communicate. So in other words, you sort of think, why are they communicating? Why are they communicating? And it seems to me, and what they say is that the laws, if you like, God's laws, the law, the law of the law of the world post this world, because obviously here, basically, this is a kind of free for all, isn't it? You can do anything you like. I mean, in this world, I mean, it is a bit of a free for all. But then the overriding, if you like, law of life is love, and so therefore,
that's what Jesus told us when he was
exactly,
there.
and
he's is still saying from there. But
yeah, they're largely pacifistic,
progressing, as you point out in the book, and as he points out through you in the book. We have a lot of progressing to do when we get there, but that's not what Christianity teaches at all.
No, and so after I had this bang on the head, all of a sudden I'm walking around feeling completely different for a few years and not understanding why. And I became kind of very pacifistical, but it was very strange. I mean, I wasn't pacifistic at all. I used to shoot animals, I used to game shoot and all this sort of thing.
You had to get hit over the head.
And about a month after my jaw was where I'd fallen on my face, I'd smashed on my face and my jaw was broken. And I was a real mess when I had this accident. Oh my goodness, your jaw. I bet that's what happened. Anyway, that's what happened. And I remember about a month later, I had some shooting trips booked. And from my friend phoned me up, he said, you're all wide. Have you all healed up now? 2 months later. And I said, yeah. And he said, so we've got the shooting trip booked, game shooting, animal, bird shooting. And I said, I can't shoot an animal. I can't kill an animal. He said, why not? You've been killing him for years. And I went, I don't know. I didn't really associate it with this thing. He said, but I can't really do that anymore. And then I became a bit sort of pacifist, I'm completely pacifistic, but and so then more and more I was getting critical. And just after that, we were going, George Bush and Tony Blair were talking about going to war in Iraq, and then there was these Christian leaders coming out and saying, we can tell you, Mr. President, that it meets the just war theory. And I'm thinking, just war theory? It doesn't sound like Jesus at all.
Yes.
So what these communicators say after, they're going, don't fall for it. Jesus, no one died for your sins. There is no just war theory, and anyone that gets involved in all that stuff, so particularly the leaders, not as much the soldiers that have been co-opted, but the leaders, they're going to have to account. And just say, if you want to go to war, but you will have to account. But it won't be permanent.
That he wanted to communicate at that time was to somehow try to stop the nonsense that was the first half of the 20th century.
And is, by the way.
Yes.
Not so much, but still is.
Yeah, I mean, even now, there are all these wars going on. Everyone's fighting everybody else. So ridiculous.
And they all say that God told them to do it, and Jesus on their side. So it's kind of crazy. And I mean, we had a situation when the Americans, if you like, went into Syria, and they were trying to, and obviously the British would normally go wherever the Americans go. They would normally go.
And in the house of your people to just follow us around with your guns at the ready.
We're the worst. I tell you, we're the worst. And anyway, and when that was all going on, to give an example, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, wanted to go. He went into the House of Parliament and put a vote forward to go to war, to join the Americans in doing airstrikes. And he got turned down. The first time it's ever happened in a parliament. Anyway, a couple of years later, everything's potting up and Obama's there and they're talking about chemical strikes and all the rest of it. And so anyway, so then the Archbishop of Canterbury, stood up in the House of Lords and said exactly the same thing years before. He said, well, he's talking on behalf of the church, that the just war theory has been met. And then, a year later, they went to war. And you sort of think, if there's one person in the world who shouldn't be talking about going to war, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the more I look at Christianity in terms of how many, obviously, some amazing people who are Christians around the world, billions of them, but the way the church is operated, to me, it just seems nonsense, really. And of course, then you get all these communications. They're all saying it is nonsense. It's nonsense.
But you have to understand how Christianity started. It's not what Jesus started. He started the way, which went for 300 years perfectly peacefully all around the Mediterranean Sea. And then this Roman Constantine, who wanted to, mobilize his armies, saw in the clouds a cross, and a voice spoke to him and said, "By this sign you shall conquer." He said, "Oh, great!" So he decided to start his own religion and call it Christianity. And he called together the Roman Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, and they designed his religion. And at the center of it was this notion that Jesus had died for our sins. They made up Christianity 300 years plus after Jesus died, and they put Jesus' name on it, but it had nothing to do with anything about Jesus. They invented that whole dogma of nonsense.
Exactly. I thought the funny as in kind of mad, if you like.
Crazy.
The funny thing about Constantine was, the story I know is that in 312, he was facing a battle, and it was a battle of a superior force. And his army won the battle, and that's when he saw the cross. So anyway, so then what happens is he's kind of adopted. He hasn't converted, but he's kind of adopted. And he cites the Christian God, and so he's now becoming more friendly and stop persecuting the Christ cults, I suppose you call them, because Christianity as a frame wasn't around then. And then what happens is in 325 they have the Council of Nicaea. And then in 326, when you would expect him to be slightly different, he goes on a killing rampage and kills his wife and whoever he kills. Starts killing loads of people. And then finally in 337, he's now 65 years old, I think, and he's on his deathbed. And that's when he gets baptized, because he knows he's not going to commit any more sins afterwards. In other words, they wait till the last minute. And I thought to myself, do you think God doesn't know that? Do you think he hasn't thought of that? And it just sits the more I look at it, it all seems completely bonkers,
Oh, it's so awful. Oh my goodness. And then there were 9 different councils, Roman councils, where they designed during the first 1,000 years, where they designed this religion. And you want so much, because I was so devout as a Christian. Right up until I went to college and really studied all this.
Well, you really? Oh, okay. I was the opposite.
Okay.
Well, I grew up as an atheist. I've never been that sort of.
But I know I was very, very religious. And then I went and married a Catholic who's religious to this day. So, God has a sense of humor. Oh, does God have a sense of humor? So, you just do the best you can. But eventually Jesus tells you what you have to do. And it's the willing that he speaks to. And I've always been willing, and I've always said, use me however you can. So he does, but he does a sense of humor. Oh,
absolutely. Well, I think the other thing that was interesting about the book was because so there I am. I'm basically, you've got all these afterlife reports. There's been thousands of them around the world talking about what happens after we die, and whether there's reincarnation or not, and all this kind of stuff, and what judgment is, and then what is hell? Is it self-imposed, and is it just a state of being, or is it all this kind of thing? And then what's interesting, and so I wasn't really, and so I haven't looked at that, and then I started looking at, because when I started looking at some of these biblical scholars, and obviously there's some biblical scholars who are what you call linguistic scholars or historical scholars, who and the most famous one, I suppose, would be Bart Ehrman. Who, do you know Bart Ehrman? You know of him?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, and I read a couple of his books years ago. He's very interesting. But what was interesting about him, from my perspective, coming from a non-religious background, was he was a man. He's obviously a bright guy, and he was a scholar, and he became a fundamentalist Christian, which I always find interesting. That anybody becomes a fundamentalist, and so he believed in the literature, the whole Bible, and he believed the whole thing word for word. And then he started researching, and then he lost his faith, basically. And so he lost his faith. And so what happened? So even now he has podcasts. He's had New York Times best-selling books. He's got millions of viewers, and he's basically deconstructing the Bible and coming to exactly the same conclusions that all these other communicators are coming. But the only difference is he's kind of like he's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, he's not considered that that's not the only game in town. So he now identifies as agnostic atheist. There's a lot of them do. There's a lot of these podcasts where they've spent their whole lives looking at the Bible and deconstructing it, but they've reverted to atheism. And they go, well, not so fast, not so fast. But they're fascinating because they are so there was a lot of information. So you've got all these sources kind of saying the same thing, probably unconnected. I mean, I doubt those scholars have ever even looked at the stuff we're talking about. So no, it's fascinating. It's all good news. It seems to me it's a good news thing. I mean, it's kind of, if you were coming up with an alternative sort of gospel, if you like, it's a much more fair and equitable one. In the sense that no one gets away with anyone, but no one's consigned to the dustbin of hell forever and all this sort of thing. And basically everything's based on love, and there's judgment. Judgment is part of a process. We die, but judgment is based on conscience, and conscience, and you come through it. It's best if you work on it here.
Jesus is not a Christian. The Christianity was begun by Constantine 300 years after Jesus' death. Jesus was a devout, very well educated and devout Jew. That's obvious from the Gospels.
Yeah, and I mean, some of those early Jewish things, like the Ebionites are interesting, aren't they? They seem to be more on the money. I mean, they seem to be on more on the they seem to have it kind of worked out. And it's still fascinating to me that after all that, how they ended up as seeing that Jesus was actually just, because obviously how do we talk about divine? Because I mean, he's saying I'm in communication. He's saying I'm not God. There's still God the Father. I'm divine as you're divine. You'll be divine. I was the first. You're coming along.
What told me was that the reason he came to Earth was to try to teach people, because he could see that they were just turning on the wheel, as the Buddhists say, incarnating over and over again unnecessarily, because you can do all you need to do in one lifetime. You don't have to learn all you need to do to advance spiritually right to the top in one lifetime. That Jesus taught us that. But people are not learning it in churches. That's unfortunate. So he taught us what we need to know. And that's in the Gospels. We can do it. We can zoom right to the top in one life.
The problem isn't the Bible. The problem, as they said, the problem that he said, I mean, they say in this communication, they say the Bible has been messed around with, and there's so many things on it that have been, like the book of Revelation, that can't be read on. But as they say, there's enough there to get you to heaven, but you've got to read it in the right way.
You've got to study it, and you've got to follow Jesus, which they don't do in the churches.
Well, exactly. But the thing is, if you take what they're saying is, so they're saying there is no original sin. They're saying Jesus isn't God as in God the Father. Jesus is divine, and he's become an emanation of God rather than a creature, and we are as well, which is how they perceive to be in Christ.
We are all divine. Jesus,
and we're all divine.
We are really all divine. He is telling us he's no more divine than we are. He is. Yeah,
he's just saying that he was the first.
Man, but so are we. That's what he's telling us.
Yeah. So it's good news from that point of view. And I think the other thing that's just
that's why I love your book. It really is all good news. It's just we don't listen to it.
Yeah, and we have to accept that it's. I mean, what I found very interesting was is the idea of forgiveness. And obviously, now it's interesting because all religions and all theologians talk about forgiveness. But here, we kind of see it as a sort of virtue, really. I mean, in other words, someone does something bad to you, and you say, well, you might not forgive them for a while. Someone might have treated you really badly, and you think, I don't feel like forgiving people, and we see it as a virtue. But what they're talking about there is it's not a virtue; it's essential. And so, therefore,
Yes,
if
that's
you
true.
haven't forgiven anyone,
It taught us that it was essential too.
it's a
But
lot
Jesus
easier to forgive
taught a
here than there.
technique. Jesus taught a technique that does not show up in the Gospels. Prevenient forgiveness. And he taught it, but it doesn't show up there because it involves hand gestures, which they didn't understand the value of them.
Hmm.
So I'm really seriously thinking um, teaching a class in prevenient forgiveness. Prevenient meaning that the forgiveness actually comes before the acts. You forgive everything ahead of time.
Yeah,
And
it's a state of mind. Yeah,
yeah, that's
it's
exactly
got
right.
rid.
It's a state of mind. You don't allow yourself ever to take offense at anything anyone does to you.
I mean, the forgiver. I mean, it's a state of mind, and it's got really nothing to do with the other person in the sense that obviously
Yes,
we see obviously if someone kills
exactly.
a child, we see that as a terrible act, but you don't condemn the person. What they're saying, which just makes more sense to me, has made more sense for years and years, is that it's a good idea to get into that state of mind before you leave. I'll give an example. I'll give an example. A friend of my family, a friend of my mother's, but he's younger than me, got pancreatic cancer recently, a few years ago. And he asked me to go and see him. I go and see him. We'd have conversations. And he said to me, he said, I've got a bucket list. And I went, okay. My mind doesn't work like that anymore. I was sort of more. And he said, and I said, oh, what sort of bucket list? He said, well, he said, I'm going to fly a World War II plane or something and parachute out of a plane. And he said, I'm going to do something with pancreatic cancer awareness, which he did a fantastic job. He became the sort of poster boy and went on TV and all this sort of thing, advocating for early disclosure. But I was thinking about myself about a bucket list, and I thought, I have an internal bucket list. I don't have an external bucket list. And my internal bucket list, which I hope I've achieved already, but is there anyone I haven't forgiven? Have I got
Yeah,
any enemies? Because if you
yeah,
haven't got any enemies, then no one to forgive, and you try and sort yourself out as much as you can, then you're in reasonable shape,
yeah,
as far as I can see. And by the way, if we're wrong, and there's nothing, well, we'll never know anyway, will we? But so I don't think there's any doubt about that. You know, it's about I remember during my publishing book spheres. Obviously, I've had lots of conversations with authors. As a guy I mentioned in the book called Michael, who was a New Zealander. He was a New Zealand vicar priest for forever, and he used to get in touch, and we'd have these kind of chats for about 9 years before he died. He died a couple of years ago, and he said. But it was quite funny how we had different, because he was where I was an atheist before, he was my sort of go-to kind of chat. And about 2 weeks before he died, he called me up because he discovered WhatsApp, and he called me up at like 6 in the morning. He's in Australia or New Zealand, and it's
yeah.
in the evening. And we have these 2 hour chats, so I'm trying to get away. Anyway, he calls me up one day, and I said, "How are you, Michael?" And he's a really lovely guy. And he said to me, "I'm having nightmares." And he was about 93, I suppose, 92. And I said, what are you fearful of then? Because it's almost like sort of therapy sessions, because we had conversations that he couldn't have with his flock, which is a shame in itself, isn't it? So I said, what are you fearful of? And he said, oblivion. Because I'd always joke about, I said, Michael, you were a priest for 65 years. Didn't you get the whole immortal Jesus, immortal soul and all that? Didn't you figure that out? He said, well, no. He said, but he was fearful. Like, he died about 2 weeks later. So he was fearful about oblivion. And I said to him, that's interesting, Michael, because I have no fear of oblivion. I have no problem with going to sleep one night and not waking up. I said, every night I go to sleep, and I haven't worried about not waking up. I'm not worried about that at all. I'm worried about dying and waking up in the basement of the many mansions.
Oh dear. Not
So I
at
said, so I
all.
said, I'm more interested in that, not worried, but you know
Yeah,
what
that,
I mean.
that would be pretty bad, but I wouldn't, I'm not worried about
He didn't
that.
say, no, no, I was joking, but
You
you know what I
should be
mean.
there.
But it was funny. He was worried about like ceasing to exist, which I don't, I don't really. I mean, we all have a fear of dying, but I don't have a fear of death. But I don't have any doubt either. So I think it's a win-win, isn't it?
No, but forgiving everything is very, very important.
The forgiver always wins.
Yes, yes. Forgiveness is the gift you give to yourself. You
Yeah,
free yourself from every possible. It's like taking all the chains off. You
yeah.
take off every chain and you're free. That's what forgiveness.
And it might not be easy, but it is a state of mind. I remember after I had this accident, I started doing volunteer service. I don't know why. I just felt like doing service. Right? Well, I never did any of that before, And so we have a telephone service here. Well, it's a walk-in as well, a suicide line for people who are feeling suicide. It's called the Samaritans. And it's a big thing here. They get. And so I did that for 11 years. You spend 3 hours a week and talking. And you realize, you're talking to people who've had terribly traumatic experiences, everybody from kids who've been raped to murderers in prison. I mean, you name it, you get
Oh,
everybody.
yeah,
And what there was an overwhelming kind of, not overwhelming, but there was a huge amount of people, quite often women, who were kind of probably our age, my age, middle aged or whatever, who were abused, sexually abused, say when they were children, or probably by their father, stepfather, generally someone in the family, and they're still dealing with it, and so and obviously you don't give advice. We don't give advice or anything like that, and we listen. Maybe you might prompt things, but you don't give advice. But the one thing you realise was they were still suffering because they hadn't forgiven the person. And I know it sounds
yeah,
easy not to forgive the person, but because they hadn't forgiven the person, although the person's probably dead, the person who they're talking about
yeah.
has still got power over them.
That's right.
And,
That's right.
and the only way to let that power go is to not have that power, is to get it out. So now, and so of course, it's easy to say. It's easy to say, and I'm sure if you've had that, I haven't had that done to me. I might have had some things done to me when I was a kid, but it is but so we can say it's a virtue here, but after we die, it's essential. I remember in an earlier book I did, there was Dowding, Lord Dowding, who was the Air Chief Marshal of the Battle of Britain, and he started going to sort of sittings, and he wrote books about life after death, and he had all these sort of dead airmen following him around when he was sitting people and coming through and all the rest of it, and these groups. And he wrote books about it until he died,
Yeah.
really interesting books. And he was a highly decorated military guy. And anyway, in one of his books, there was a Norwegian came through. And he made a good example. And the Norwegian guy came through. So he's a dead Norwegian killed by the Nazis in World War II. And he says, and they're coming through because the group are helping, because these people are all in the so-called lower levels, or the earth planes, whatever you want to call it, and they're helping them to move on. And the Norwegian comes through and he says, I was a shopkeeper. And he said, I was killed by the Germans. And he said, I'm stuck here. And he said, I know I can't move on. I can't move beyond where I am now until I've forgiven the Germans. And I know I've got to do it. And he said, but I haven't done it yet. And that's why I'm stuck. And he said, now I know why Jesus said, forgive everybody before you die. It's really important. And I thought that was interesting. And I think there's a lot
Very,
to that.
very,
And of
very.
course, these are old kind of, been around for thousands of years, and but nevertheless still very current, let's say, in
And
people's
it's not
lives.
hard. It's easy. There's
Well, I wouldn't
that
say it's easy. I
physical
wouldn't say. I mean, I
that
found it.
physical process that Jesus taught. It's mechanical, and it works beautifully. And my spirit guide taught it to me, and he said that Jesus taught it. But the reason that it never made it into the Bible was that people didn't understand that the mechanical process that Jesus taught with your
Hmm.
hands
Yeah,
was
I
what
don't know
made it.
about that.
So I'm going to have to
But
teach it. I'm going to have to teach it because people don't understand how easy it can be to forgive. If you reteach your mind. We taught our mind to hold grudges. Now we have to teach our minds to let them go.
yeah, I think the other thing is I think obviously if you think this is all there is, then obviously there's injustice everywhere, and I mean, that's why we have all these revenge films on TV, because it's all about justice, people not getting justice. And so therefore, if you think this is all there is, then there is no justice. And therefore that's a problem. And then this other idea, even amongst Christians or religious people, not, I mean, everyone's different, obviously, I'm generalizing, that the afterlife or something is something way off over there, something kind of secondary. And they're going, no, it's not secondary. This is the beginning, but that's where all the action is.
Yeah, this is just preliminary to our real lives.
Yeah, so if you're looking for things out, if you're looking for things out here and something over there, so in other words, if something really bad happens to you here, if you're looking from this perspective, it's the worst thing in the world that's happened. But if you were suddenly died and found out you haven't died, then you go, actually, okay, is that what that was all about?
Yeah, that was just a bad dream. This is, and now that I've died from that, this is real. This is the real life.
And that goes on. So I think there's a lot to be. So I think there's a lot of, people can be helped, but obviously, when you say, in theory it's easy, but you know how it is. A belief is tough to shake off here. People struggle to forgive. It can be easy for you or easy for me, but for someone else it can be, well, not impossible, but it can be very hard. But what they're saying is it's good to do that. It's good to try and do it while you're here, because once you're there, because it's even harder, because beliefs are harder to shake.
Yeah.
That's why people who believe in darkness and oblivion find darkness, and they find it in that kind of thing.
They do that, and then they have to be rescued from it. Exactly right.
Yeah, and that seems to be going on. The higher are helping the lower, and the higher helping the lower. And then you look at it, and they're all talking about how wonderful it is and how they're having a fantastic time, and they're helping the people having a not fantastic time. Because we're all going, well, why are the people not having? And they're not all just evil criminals or anything like that. They're often people who have the wrong thing. Yeah,
that's right.
Exactly.
So true.
Exactly.
Well, I think your book is lovely, and
it's very kind of you. And I appreciate you looking at it.
No, it's very good, and it's wonderful that you. I'm so sorry that you had to fall on your face to just go.
I know that was coming.
The greater reality.
That kind of started the ball rolling. It was a strange. There was a life before. Before that, I never talked about this. I've never had I was in, like I say, I was in the music business. I was having great fun. Well, it was a stressful life, but it was a completely different life. And all of a sudden, so it was it was a couple of events really. It was two events really. Have we got time? How long have we got?
We have a little bit. Like we've got 3 minutes or something.
Oh, okay, I won't be. But anyway, that was the start of it, really. But there were two. Yeah, there were two events. I'd had this bang on the head. I had a couple of years where I couldn't understand what was going on. Literally, I felt completely. It's like you're feeling very serene and content, and you're looking at yourself as going through this mad life, and you're not. And suddenly, I'm not interested in any of the business I was in, and you're not interested in material stuff, which is very. For everybody around you, it wasn't fun. And then what happened was 2 years in, and I didn't put anything down to this accident. So I wasn't associating, but I was journaling. I didn't really understand it. And then 2 years afterwards, one night, I was writing this journal as I did every night. Wrote this journal about, and I was having dreams I'd never had before, and all this kind of stuff, and premonition, and all sorts of odd things. Well, what I thought was odd then, and not really understanding it, but feeling this very serene kind of self, like I'm the witness looking at my own self going crazy, sort of thing, that sort of thing. And then what happened was on this one particular evening, a friend of mine popped into my mind who died in my house 14 years before. Yeah. And I was thinking about how he died and wondering whether I could have done anything about it, because he died from it wasn't my fault. He died of a brain hemorrhage. He fell over. He'd had a head injury, funny enough. He'd been out. He was staying with me because he split up with his girlfriend. And so I was thinking about, could I have taken him to hospital? I wasn't feeling guilty, but I was just observing because he popped into my mind. And I wrote down, I was writing about what happened that night and asked the question, I wonder if I'd have taken him to hospital, whether he'd still be here, even though when it happened, the coroner said he wouldn't have been, it wouldn't, and all this sort of thing. He basically fractured his skull in a bar and had a brain hemorrhage, but there was no sign of it. So anyway, so this happened while I'm writing a journal, 2 years after I've had a head injury. And I'm just writing about it. And then 3 days, and while I'm writing about it, I'm living in this house that we've been renovating, and I've got a whole new kitchen. And I went to make some toast, and I plugged the toaster in, and the kitchen lights fused.
Well, I remember the story from your book. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I can tell you quickly. And then anyway, 3 or 4 days after that, So I've been writing about this guy who's popped into my mind, who died in my house 14 years before. And I've asked the question, could I have done anything about it in my writing? And then 3 days later, my sister, who's 6 years younger than me, called me out the blue late one night and said to me that some school friends of hers that they'd met up with recently, she said she wanted me to phone her school friend's wife. And I said, well, why? And she said, I can't tell you because if I tell you, you won't call her, but please call her. And she was very insistent. And it was 11 o'clock at night or something. And so reluctantly, I called this number and her school friend, and I remember his name, but I didn't remember him really. His name was Johnny, and my name's Jonathan John. So anyway, his name is Johnny. So he says, hi, John, how are you? And then he put me on to his wife. He said, my wife needs to talk to you. I can't explain it. You'll think she's mad, but she's not mad. Trust me. I said, okay. So I'm now talking to his wife. Well, I've got no idea who she is. She has no idea who I am. And she tells me the story that her grandfather has died. The grandfather died and she was feeling a bit down. And so she went to see a medium. I didn't know anything about mediums, had no interest in mediums. And she said halfway through this, she thought her grandfather had come through, and I'm sort of sitting there on the phone. Imagine thinking, why am I talking to this person? And then she's halfway through that she said someone called Brian came through who had a connection to John. Now her husband's name's John. She had no idea who Brian was, and he gave her all this information. And so she takes the information home because she said she doesn't understand any of it, and tells her husband. And her husband said, "This isn't for me." He said, "This is for my friend Nick, my sister." He's talking about his friend, my sister, whose brother, me, he had a friend called Brian who died in his house. So she had to talk to me. So I'm now on the phone and she's talking to me. Bear in mind, this is 3 days after I'd asked the question. And she said, he's got a message for you. Bear in mind, she has no idea who he is. And I said, okay, what's the message? And she said, you've been thinking about him in the last few days. And she wants you to know there's nothing you could have done. It was his time, which throws up philosophical
way.
And then he said, you've got a problem with your kitchen electrics as well. I mean, and I'm thinking, and after that, I thought, there's no way she could ever know anything about that. So that prompted me to read the literature. That prompted me to start meet some resident mediums. And that's when I started understanding that this bang on the head 2 years before had triggered some spiritually, and that really catapulted me up. That's the beginning, really.
Exactly.
And I mentioned that in the book. I mentioned it, in
yes, it was in the book. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's really neat.
Yeah.
Wow. So what do you want people to take from our conversation today?
Well, I would say that it's all good. I would say it's all good news. I think the most important thing is to assume. I always say there's friends of mine. Bear in mind, most of my friends are atheists. None of them are. And they said, "Should I read your book?" And I said, "Well, it's probably a good idea to read it before you die, because if you die and you find out still alive, you might find it quite handy."
It's all good news.
But try not to kill anyone, because you will have to account. It's not a great idea killing people. Try not to do it. George Bush, Tony Blair, and Vladimir Putin's, they're all out there saying God's on their side. He's not on your side. He's not on anyone's side.
No.
He's just love. Yeah.
As long as everything you do is out of true love, not just out of, you got your finger on the scale and you're thinking that's a loving finger, so it's okay. It's not. There's a very much bigger scale, and love is.
Yeah, I think it's good, and obviously none of us are perfect. We go into this life, and if you die and you find yourself still existing, don't ever think you're in eternal hell, because you'll get stuck. That's what they're saying. Apparently, they're piling up over there because there's so many people think like that, especially from the West. Which is understandable. I mean, imagine you've had 2,000 years of people believe, even if you're an atheist, you think you've had this heaven and hell thing in the back of your mind, and you find you in this sort of lovely environment. You think, what's this? It's not heaven. There's no harps playing, and there's no sense of time. So then they say some people realize they understand where they are within minutes, and other people have been there 1,000 years and still haven't figured it out as we measure time.
Yeah. So try to have an open mind. I tell people just accept.
Have an open mind. Assume you're going to carry on. Just assume you're going to carry on.
Yes. Let it happen as it's going to happen.
I think that's the best thing you could say to someone.
Just stay right there. I just have to tell people who we're going to have as a guest next week, and because I want to speak to you for a minute after this.
Okay.
All right. Oh my goodness. We've come to the end of our time. I could have talked to John forever. The book is called No One's Dead, the Jesus Messages, and I really highly recommend it. But again, we've come to the end of our time, and this has been Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Please remember and never forget that you are a powerful, eternal being. You never began and you never will end. If you're alive now, I'm telling you, this is it. You are an eternal being. So please, as John said, live as if you're going to live forever, and you're going to have to account for the things you do, because that's the truth. Next week, our guest will be Debbie Dobbins, who will be with us for the second time. She is lovely. Debbie helps entrepreneurs to rewrite their personal life stories about money, power, and purpose. After building successful businesses herself and making millions and teaching abundance for decades, she found herself, I can't believe this, but she told us the story, face to face with a cancer diagnosis, broken, and food stamps. She had a good hard talk with herself, and then through feminine energy, intuition, and radical reinvention, she not only healed her body and rebuilt her wealth, but she imagined what true success means. Now, Debbie Dobbins is the author of Your Inner Billionaire, which is another great book. It's a potent blend of prosperity principles, spiritual truths, and no-nonsense real talk. Her work blends universal laws, quantum consciousness, and grounded strategies to help those conscious entrepreneurs who really want to do it right to claim their abundance. She calls herself the Queen of Magic for a reason, and her mission is to help others remember that they too hold a magic wand. This week we've been talking with my wonderful friend Jonathan Beecher. He's the head of White Crow Books, which is based in the UK, where it's midnight as we've been talking, and he's the leading publisher of first quality books on death and the afterlife. John has been sharing with us a truly amazing book that he authored himself. It includes channeled messages received primarily via automatic writing around the turn of the previous century, and primarily, or many of them, are from Jesus, and I truly believe they are, having seen them. It sounds like my friend Jesus, believe me. He's talking seriously to us, and the book is called No One's Dead, the Jesus Messages. By now, as we have learned this week again, Jesus has quite a lot to say to us, and it's time that we really took him seriously. We also should mention here that our dear friend Craig Hogan is the president and guru of Seek Reality Online. That's seekreality.com. We've gathered there as much information as we possibly can about where we're going next. And it's time, frankly, for a lot of people to decide that they really want to know where we're going next, and how best to learn what we can here in order to get there. Because as John's book tells us, hey, we haven't done enough work here for us really to make the best possible sense of where we're going next. And we need to do that. I mean, if life is eternal, we need to know how to live eternally. That's very, very, very important. But for now, meanwhile, this has been Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Please enjoy and make the most of this coming week in our one reality, always knowing that you are a powerful, eternal being, and you, most of all in this whole universe, you are infinitely, eternally, perfectly, and forever loved.
You've been listening to Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Roberta blogs and answers questions at robertagrimes.com. Join us every week as we explore what the afterlife evidence and modern science combine to tell us is true about the one reality we all share. Knowing the truth changes everything.